Michael Barbaro inledde sin journalistiska karriär som ekonomireporter för The Washington Post 2002, innan han 3 år senare tog klivet till The New York Times. Där började han snart rapportera om politik och fick inför valet 2016 uppdraget att leda tidningens podcast The Run-Up. I februari året därpå lanserade The New York Times en ny poddsatsning, The Daily. Michael Barbaro har sedan dess axlat programledaransvaret för podden som varje vardag släpper ett nytt avsnitt och som har över 10 miljoner lyssnare i månaden. Det gör den till en av världens mest populära podcast som bland annat genererat en Peabody-nominering och ett DuPont Columbia University Award för Audio Excellence.
Hi Michael, how are you?
I'm well. Good morning. Good morning here.
Yeah, good morning there. So please, first start by telling us what we're seeing.
You are seeing the accidental home studio of The Daily in Germantown, New York. This is where I began hosting the show on March 9th when the virus and the pandemic really began to reach New York City. And what began as a couple of days experiment in working from home never really ended. And we've been doing it for months. And so behind me, if I can adjust my seat a little bit, is the not so fancy studio where the show gets made every day with a combination of quieting material and a Google Hangout that we reach our guests on.
You're in your country house and you're there alone. I mean, you don't have any guests coming there or...
Nope. We really do take the social distancing part of the guidelines pretty seriously.
Mm-hmm. So most welcome to the Swedish Grand Prize for Journalism.
Thank you. I couldn't be more honored to be here and to be part of this. So thank you.
The honor is all ours. Michael, so you're okay, but how is the United States these days?
That's a slightly more complicated question. We are in the middle of a pretty singular and an ugly moment in our political history. We have just declared a president-elect, Joe Biden, and we have an incumbent president who refuses to concede the race, and beyond that is deliberately sowing doubts about the legitimacy of the election and making baseless, in many cases false claims about voter fraud. So this is a pretty delicate moment in our history as a country.
And is this just another post-election controversy that will blow over, or will this drag on, you think?
I think the way I would answer that question and frame it is that no matter how long this particular conflict persists, call it 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then there's a transition, I think what's occurring in this moment is going to have profound implications for how tens of millions of Americans view the presidency, but also the future of elections. And I think it's very destructive, and we're attempting to chronicle it without amplifying it. And it's pretty tricky as a balancing act.
I bet it is. And what do you mean by a profound effect on millions on Americans?
Well, I think the rituals of transition, these images, I mean, actually it's 4 years to the day when President Barack Obama invited President-elect Donald Trump and his wife Melania Trump to the White House for the photos and images of a peaceful transition of power. George W. Bush did the same with President-elect Obama. And right now, we're not experiencing the kind of collective catharsis of such images and such a transition. And I think what instead we're getting is claims of fraud, refusal to concede. And I think that can't do anything other than kind of poison the way a lot of Americans view the election. And it's not necessary, and it's probably quite damaging to our democratic process.
So I think it's around 70 days until inauguration. Do you think that Donald Trump will be there, be part of that?
Our colleagues' reporting suggests that he will not be an enthusiastic participant in the inauguration of his successor, that he is disinclined to show up for the inauguration. And I don't know how important that is, but I think, like everything we're seeing over the past few days, it will accumulate in the kind of collective understanding of this moment, and it will represent the degradation of tradition and ritual and the peaceful transfer of power.
Michael, you have covered Donald Trump extensively, first as a business reporter and then later covering his campaign. You have met him, you have spoken to him. How would you describe his attraction, so to speak? I mean, why is he so popular among half of the American people?
Well, I think Donald Trump recognized, in a way very few people have, just how alienated a meaningful number of Americans are from the two major parties in the United States. The belief by many of these voters that politics serves those in power. And he arrived with a message of disruption and disregard for tradition. And for many people of both parties, especially Republicans, but also some traditional groups of Democrats, this was profoundly refreshing. And it was encapsulated in the very way he spoke. He spoke differently, with a level of provocation and candor and a lack of political correctness that for many people sounded a lot like the way they talked about politics in their backyards and over their dinner tables, and did not resemble the polished way that American political figures speak, and therefore felt like, okay, this guy really means what he says. He's going to disrupt and change. And that was very appealing.
And you have also done investigative work about him, about business, his businesses, and also about the way he treated women. Something that he wasn't very happy about. I understand it. So how did he react, and what was it like to have someone that powerful, if you will, not being friendly to you?
Well, the reporting, I think, was quite important because it got at these questions that I think have dogged President Trump throughout his time in office, which are, is he an honest business person? Does he pay his bills? Does he represent his brand honestly to the people who, for example, enrolled in Trump University, which was an experience that cost many people $30,000, and they felt it was ultimately a fraud in their experience. And reporting on these stories made the president, even when he was not president, very angry. And he's a very nimble user of social media, and he understands the power of unleashing his supporters on journalists. And from the very beginning of his campaign up through the now end of his presidency, he has treated the news media as literally enemies, and not just enemies of him, but in his words, enemies of the people. And that has represented, as does his behavior over the past few days, a very unique kind of threat to the way our democracy has functioned.
And as I understand it, he unleashed, as you call it, his supporters against you personally.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, by the time I had completed some of these investigations, none of which had ever been disputed factually, he had asked on Twitter for my resignation. And that's never a pleasant experience. But you get up and you do your job, and you know, you hope that no one on Twitter does anything more than just tweet at you. and that was the experience. This all lived on social media, not in the physical world.
Okay. As you said, media, and I mean CNN, but not the least the New York Times has been attacked over and over by this president. You said it yourself, enemy of the people, an infamous description by Trump, by President Trump. How, being a journalist for the New York Times, being a journalist in the USA today, How have you dealt with that?
Well, it's a big reason why we created the Daily the way we did. We understood when we created the show, which was 2 months after Donald Trump was elected, that we were entering a media world filled with distrust. And I think, as awful as the experience was of hearing the president describe the news media as enemy of the people, or fake news, as he called it, it crystallized for us our mission, which was we have to recognize how many Americans do not trust the news media. I don't believe that's merited, but it's a reality. And he made that problem worse. And for us, it meant, how do you tell stories in a way that will build trust, rebuild that trust? And for us, that meant being more transparent, letting the journalists do a lot more of the work of describing how they obtained information, admitting when they're not certain about things rather than pretending they know the answer to something that they don't. I think there's a long journalistic tradition of what I like to call kind of false authority. We pretend we know things and we can speak with great sweep and with great certainty. And I think after 2016, we had lost some of that credibility, especially the way we all covered that election, and the president reinforced it, and it meant we needed to just approach this a bit differently.
And was this easier to do on the Daily than in the paper, the version of
Yes.
New York Times? And why?
Yes, it's a very smart observation, because in audio you have a chance for a conversation. Print is a one-sided journey. I am presenting you with a story that I have reported and I have written and has been edited, and I'm kind of handing it down to you, and you're welcome, and I hope you enjoy it. And in audio, two people are having a conversation. There's curiosity and there's a kind of battle of ideas, and there's a chance for the journalist to become a three-dimensional person who went off and did reporting. And you can hear the way we often present the story. You can hear them actually doing the reporting. You can hear a reporter asking a question of a Trump supporter, and you can hear what words they chose, and you can hear the voters' response, and you can hear the back and forth and the tenor of it. And it's just a very rich, humanizing experience, and it almost immediately lowers the temperature, I think, because you're actually experiencing the journalism.
Do you know if it works? I mean, do you know if you kind of reach the people that distrust established media?
We hear from Republicans in the United States who find that the show resonates with them, find that it has sought to tell stories in a different way. And we just know from the audience, which is now, in the millions of listeners a day, that we are reaching a large group of people who I believe were seeking out a new way of experiencing the daily news.
For you and for other journalists in the US, these 4 years with Donald Trump as president, how have you done to stay neutral, or at least professional, in your reporting about him and his presidency?
That part wasn't so hard. I mean, we needed to do what we always do, which is, approach a story with an open notebook, as our executive editor, Dean Baquet, says, which is something we have done at the New York Times for centuries. But I think the challenge in some ways was presenting this presidency fairly and neutrally, but not naively. We understood from the very beginning that this was going to be a president who routinely made false claims. And it's a tricky business of declaring that the president is being dishonest, in some cases knowingly dishonest, so therefore lying, and seeming to be neutral. But we have to do it. And so, for example, by the time we reached this week, we understood our role. Our role was to report the results of the election and declare that Joe Biden was president-elect, and then also to be very clear that Donald Trump's claims were without merit and without factuality. And I think there might have been a time, call it 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, where we might have presented those claims a little more with. I think there was a time a few years ago where we would have presented those claims alongside the rest of the news without being so declarative about the fact that they were wrong. And we have learned that we can't do that.
I see. So a little bit about the Daily then, because you launched the Daily in 2017, and you had a career as a writing reporter. You wrote for the paper for many years, but still you ended up doing this audio show, this podcast.
Right.
How?
With a pretty steep learning curve. I came into this role with no experience in audio and in hosting anything other than a dinner party. And I put myself at the mercy of a very experienced group of producers who created the show. And they taught me how to host. And I had some instincts of my own, which I brought from being a print reporter, how to conduct a conversation and respond to somebody and follow my own curiosity. But I had a lot of learning to do, and I do not encourage you to go back and listen to the first few months of the show, because I'm not sure I would like you to hear what that learning curve sounded like. But the beauty of doing a daily show and being the only host, there's no other host of the show really, is that I practiced every day, and eventually I like to think got better at it.
But you said to me when we spoke earlier that they weren't actually looking for a professional TV anchor or something as a host for this, right?
Right. That's correct. The executive producer of the New York Times audio department, when she went out looking for a host, I have learned subsequently, watched a bunch of reporters on cable news in the United States and decided that she did not want anyone who was too polished and too good at delivering sound bites, because the idea of this show was to be very authentic and to have conversations that felt real. And if we're being honest, cable news often can feel a bit theatrical, and so authenticity was the goal. And so finding somebody who didn't have too much experience and that they could mold was, I think, their goal.
It's been a huge success, not just in the US but around the world. You're one of the most listened to podcasts around the world. What do you think is the key to that? I mean, reaching out as you have done.
I think that the format of the show was a breakthrough. And by that I mean there's a very long tradition of programs throughout the United States and the world. There's a very long tradition as well of narrative storytelling. If you've been in the United States, you know what This American Life is, the wonderful tradition of telling a long story with built-in suspense and drama and character and sound. And I think our insight at the Daily was that you could marry these two concepts. You could take the news as we know it, the 6:30 news, the public radio, the BBC, the sort of the news of the day, and you could literally smush it together with this tradition of narrative storytelling. And we called it narrative news. Every day we would tell just one story in a way that felt different and suspenseful and complicated and nuanced. And you would begin the story at the beginning, meaning wherever that story needed to start. If it needed to go back to the birth of NATO, we went back to the birth of NATO. If it needed to begin with the birth of the electoral college system in the United States, we went back to the founding. And every day, the act of finding out how to best tell a story over 25 minutes, just one story, whereas everybody else usually spends 2 minutes, 5 minutes on a story. I think something about that was a breakthrough for people who, I think for a long time, have watched the news or listened to the news and felt like they were being thrown into the middle of a story. And instead we said, we're going to tell you the whole story from start to finish.
And maybe, just maybe we should reveal that you're not alone doing it.
Oh no. There are about 24 people on the Daily team extraordinary talents who have been hired from some of the greatest audio shows, National Public Radio, as well as the best podcasts in the United States. And you can hear the skill that they bring. I mean, the show is extremely highly produced. And I think that's something else. I don't think anybody had ever tried to produce such highly polished and highly produced audio every day until the Daily.
How many is involved are involved in making a show?
On any given day, 6 to 8 people will touch a show, and overall we have about 24 people who are involved in the Daily.
Mm-hmm.
It's very resource intensive. I think there's been a proliferation of shows since the birth of the Daily, rivals of ours trying to make daily shows, and they often tell us that they marvel at the number of people who are involved in the Daily, and I also believe that's a big part of why the show is such a success.
And you, this is kind of a personal question, but you have a bit of a distinct voice.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some talk about the way you talk.
Yep.
Were you aware of that before you started this?
Yes, in the sense that I understand I have a somewhat distinctive style. I did not know until the show reached a very large audience that people would find it amusing or worthy of spoofs and satire and TikTok video recreations. That's been very amusing and in some ways flattering. And
where does it come from?
It comes from, I think one element of it comes from 15 years of being on the phone as a journalist. For example, I have a little bit of a habit of affirming the way people are talking to me by saying, that kind of thing. And I think that's what any good journalist does on the phone to keep your source talking. It's a little bit new in audio, and I think it threw people at the beginning, and then they came to like it. And then the second thing is that I do not fill the pauses when I don't know what to say with anything other than dead air. And that's because I had a grandfather when I was a very young boy who would criticize me if I ever said like or or and so those were stripped out of my speaking style. And so there are an unusual number of pauses in the way I talk.
Interesting. Yeah. So just the last question. You work for the New York Times. You've been working as a reporter for the New York Times and now as a host for this hugely successful podcast. This is not the reality for all journalists. What would be your advice to a young man or woman who's just starting in this trade, this profession?
My career has been really interesting in that there's almost no job I haven't done, whether it's for a very small local weekly newspaper or a regional newspaper in Connecticut where I grew up, the college newspaper where I went to college, and then after that, 5 or 6 internships and then a job at the Washington Post and finally the New York Times. I think you just have to go out and do the thing, as we say here in the States. Journalism is about repetition and what you learn from the mistakes you make very early on. I'll never forget some of the giant blunders I made when I worked at smaller newspapers, and I was really grateful to have made those errors at smaller newspapers. And I really do believe that experience and practice matter in this industry. I think we have a huge responsibility by the time we get to platforms like the New York Times or the Washington Post to be at the top of our game and to have made mistakes and learned from them. And so my advice is to just do the journalism wherever you can do it and keep doing it until you get to the place that you want to be.
Michael Barbaro, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you very much for having me.